Good morning, everyone, or whatever time you're looking at this. I'm welcoming all the people from Bible class and anyone else who wants to tune in. I thought we should get started again. And may God bless your reading as you read for next Sunday, the May 24th. I'm asking you to read references about the story of John the Baptist's beheading. They are found in Matthew 14, verses 1 to 12, Mark 6, verses 14 to 29, and Luke 9, verses 7 through 9. Now, when you read those, you're going to find that Mark has more detail, and you're also going to find that Luke really does not tell the story of his beheading. He simply tells about Herod wanting to see Jesus. Previously, remember, we have seen that Jesus sent out his disciples to heal and teach in Galilee. Mark puts this story just before the story of John the Baptist's beheading, whereas in Matthew, we found it to be several chapters ago in Matthew 10. So it may have happened shortly before John's death, and maybe that's why Herod came to know the name of Jesus, because of the extra witness of the disciples, including Jesus' own witness and the crowds that have been following Jesus. It's possible one of those things may have been involved. And Jesus, remember, has been encountering increasing unbelief. Even his own family came to take him home because they thought he was beside himself. And there were the towns where he had been preaching and teaching, he speaks judgment upon because there's so much unbelief still there. And Matthew, interestingly, puts the story of Jesus' rejection at Nazareth right before this story of John's death. Mark, it's a little bit earlier, but about the same time. So remember, we already covered that story back when Luke did the version of the story near the beginning of his gospel. But in that story of the rejection of Nazareth, remember the people said, "We know this guy. Where'd he get all this? We even know his family." And this is when Jesus does that famous appeal, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That's in Matthew 11:28. He's appealing to people to come to faith. And he's also encountering much more opposition from the authorities, the leaders of the Jews, criticizing him and his disciples for what they're doing or not doing, and saying, evidently, frequently, that he is doing his miracles by the power of Beelzebub. So with more and more opposition and more unbelief seeming to continue, remember we saw that Jesus began to teach in stories, parables, trying to reach across the lack of faith that he was encountering, the seeing and not seeing, the hearing and not hearing, as he quotes from Isaiah, and telling stories. People like stories. Stories are easy to remember. And he was using the stories to illustrate and to clarify what he was teaching, and trying to get people to think about what he was teaching, and trying to see if he could teach them, get them to accept the spiritual truths he was trying to teach about God by comparing them to everyday realities they dealt with. Then besides that, remember the last time we heard about John the Baptist was when John sent some disciples to Jesus from his prison cell asking, "Are you the one, or are we supposed to wait for someone else?" And Jesus sent them back telling them, "Tell him what you see me doing. The healings, the teaching, all that I'm doing." And then when they had either left or just before they left, he talked about John in glowing terms as being one of a man among the prophets, one of the greatest men ever born, and that he was actually the fulfillment of that prophecy from Malachi that Elijah would come before the great day of the Lord. Now, remember, John has been in prison ever since Jesus began his Galilean ministry, which is either a year or more ago. because Matthew tells us in chapter 4, verse 12, and so does Mark in his gospel, that Jesus went to Galilee after John was arrested. Josephus tells us that John was imprisoned in Machaerus, one of Herod's fortress palaces near the Dead Sea, on the other side of the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. And so now we're at a point where we're maybe about a year before Jesus is crucified. The next story in Matthew and in Mark is the feeding of the 5,000. In John's version of the feeding of the 5,000, he says that it was time, just about time, for Passover. And the following Passover is Jesus' crucifixion. So we're about a year ahead of that crucifixion. Now, we need a script a little bit, or a guidance as to who these people are that are in the story. The Herod that's mentioned is not Herod the Great, not the same Herod who was around when Jesus was born. This is Herod Antipas, his son, his seventh son. He was born of a Samaritan mother. And if you remember, Herod had 10 wives and over 15 children. But he was one of the sons that Herod did respect. He was brought up in Rome. He was made a ruler in Palestine under Roman authority, what Matthew names as a tetrarch, which is the accurate title for him, a ruler of a part of a kingdom. And he's been ruling that ever since his dad died in 4 BC. He was only 17 at the time, which, if we're understanding this correctly, it may be around 29 AD, so he may be about 50, Herod. And having grown up in Rome, he had friends in Rome, including the present emperor, Emperor Tiberius. In fact, he even builds a new capital in honor of his friend Tiberius on the west coast of the Sea of Galilee. And that's where he and his wife Herodias probably lived most of the time. We wonder, having been brought up in Rome, whether he was very much Jewish or just kind of Jewish in name only and mostly Greco-Roman in his culture and beliefs. Herodias, his wife, he had married something like 5, maybe even less years ago. And she was actually also his niece. She had married a previous husband named Philip, Herod Philip, who had remained in Rome, kept his residence in Rome. So she was living in Rome when Herod Antipas went back to visit friends, maybe visit the emperor, the one who was the present emperor, and he had fallen in love with his brother's wife, and they had an affair in Rome, and then he convinced her to leave Herod Philip, who, by the way, was also her uncle, leave Herod Philip, divorce him, and come to Palestine with him and be his wife. And so he divorced his wife, who was an Arabic princess, and she went packing back home to dad, and then he married Herodias. And after Antipas had had this affair and returned and married Herodias, that's when John was condemning, after John began his own ministry, was condemning this marriage as against God's will, against God's law. It was both incest and it was divorce while the husband was still alive. Josephus characterizes Herodias as a jealous and ambitious schemer. Then one other character that you should be aware of is Herodias' daughter, which would be Herod Antipas' stepdaughter after the marriage here. She's actually the daughter of Herodias' first wife, Philip. And Josephus, again, is the one who tells us that her name was Salome. We're not told that in either Matthew or Mark, but Salome. And that when Josephus gives his own account of John's beheading, he indicates that when she danced, she was just a young teenager. marriageable age in those days, but a young teenager. So keep all that in mind as you're reading the texts about the story of John the Baptist's beheading. And then next week, my plan is, if everything goes the way we've been doing things, is to go through some of the things that are in those references and try to help understand and to add some thoughts and comments about various things that are said in the references. So read the references for next time, and next time, May 24th, the recording for that Sunday, I will try to give you some more background about it. So God bless your reading, and the Spirit leads you, and talk to you next week.